I have audio on it. Okay. Okay, great. Well, welcome back, because I actually have some people live, and I'm happy to be able to do this back live and not just stare at the camera all the time. And actually, I do want to encourage you, if you have questions, this is we need to be getting back to normal. It's wonderful in this technology and learning all this stuff to be able to make it available different ways and to record it as easily as this is. But excuse me. One of the things about the great things about the local church is it's local. We really need to have that real life interaction with one another. So I'm going to start this series on the patriarchs. And for those of you who are watching online live, if you want to send a question or something, I have somebody actually can watch the chat now and let me know if there's a question. But this is, when I was at home and there wasn't anything else going, I was just, 1 hour monologue. I'm happy not to necessarily have to do that and answer real questions along the way, as opposed to just things that I guess people might be interested in. But I'm really, as I've been working on this, kind of excited about haven't ever done a particular study on the patriarchs before. And I think it's very timely for a number of reasons, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's go ahead and open in prayer. Lord, we thank you again that you have chosen to work in history. That you chose to not have an idea about us, but to actually create a universe and to create us, and to love us so much that even when we turn from you, that you send your Son to bring us forgiveness and redemption and everlasting life. Lord, as we study some very old brothers in the faith, we ask that you would help us to be able to hear those lessons from their lives that you have recorded for us in your scriptures, that we might better understand who you are and who you've called us to be. For we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. That's kind of where I wanted to start with this in terms of really, why the Old Testament? Well, God has worked in history, and there are lessons to be learned from history, and we're invited in the scriptures to understand that the reason that the lives were recorded is that we would learn from some of those. But I also think there's a great deal of wisdom in the old saying that you do not have enough time in this life to make enough mistakes that you can afford not to learn from other people's mistakes. And one of the things that's really fascinating in that respect about the Bible is it's certainly history. It's authoritative history, because again, history is the events and the interpretation of the events. But we're invited to learn from the lives of those who have come before us. Book of Hebrews does a wonderful job, in my opinion, of going back and doing exactly that kind of history, and goes through a whole litany of the Old Testament characters to be able to say, look, one of the things they all had in common was that faith comes by righteousness. That's one of those great lessons to learn out of it. But in addition, the detail given to us about some of these folks, particularly the patriarchs, wonderful proof of how genuine and reliable the history is, because it's brutally honest about these were not perfect people by a long stretch. And a lot of their flaws are recorded for us, as well as their faith and how all that interacts, and those are great lessons for us. The one thing I would say at the beginning of this, and I'll probably repeat it a number of times, as we're going through and looking at it, do remember there are lessons for us to learn out of history, because history is not just the events, but it's the meaning of the events. But do not allegorize history. History is not an allegory. Again, the most famous allegory is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And in an allegory, every character really represents some other aspect of what the author is trying to get across. History is not an allegory, and it's interesting to go back and pull some lessons out, but we have to be careful that we don't cross over that line and turn it into an allegory. That's just one of those difficulties. And when you look at some of the different interpretations about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, you can see in some of those interpretations, in my opinion, they cross over from being history into trying to turn it into allegory. Not a new thing at all. Origen was one of the early church fathers who did a lot of allegorizing of the Old Testament in particular, and some of the other early church fathers corrected him on that. So don't go there. That's, because unfortunately, that kind of interpretation, as all interpretation, is open to interpretation. You know, this is an art as much as it is a science. And some of it, when I was doing the class before COVID on hermeneutics, how do you interpret the Bible? You know, one of those things that we have to recognize at the very beginning, one of the assumptions is, do we believe that in fact the intent of the author can be determined? Now, that is one of the beliefs that I have, you know, and as we read through and as we look at some of the events in the lives of the patriarchs and try and draw some of those lessons, that's one of those constant tensions. What's recorded for us, what was the intent of the author? Not just the human author, because we don't actually know who that was for sure. Probably Moses, but again, we don't know for sure, and that's not all that important, because at the end of the day, it's the divine authorship of the scriptures that make it authoritative. So we can still ask that question, what's the intent of the author? And in that respect, what's the intent of the author, and that author being God? Why is it that these details and this information was shared with us? I will mention, there are a lot of other resources I'll reference for if you're interested in them. Now, this is a really old book. As a matter of fact, I don't remember if I forgot to look at what year it was published. Okay. Well, really not so bad. 1973. It's called The Song of Abraham by Ellen Gunderson Traylor, and it's a historical novel. And I would really encourage you to check out some of there are some historical novels about Peter and a man called Peter, and I mean some wonderful things. This one in particular, The Song of Abraham, was wonderful. And as a historian, one of the things that I love about historical novels is that they start out by saying, okay, novel, okay, this is in the fiction section. It's based on a historical figure and historical events. But one of the things I think that historical fiction helps us with incredibly is to recognize that history is a story. And when you're reading it, particularly in the scriptures, you are not learning everything about Abraham. It's not an attempt to be a complete character study. I mean, that's one of the difficulties of history, is what things do you not record as well as what do you record. But historical novels help flesh that out. And reading Song of Abraham in particular, to me, was wonderful in terms of, that's her interpretation, but really filling out the character of Abraham and Lot and Rebecca and, Abraham and Sarah. I think later in the book, Rebecca's there because Abraham was still alive during that, and that was part of his life also. But anyway, all of those characters and really kind of fleshing them out. But one of the things I appreciate about historical fiction is that I think it's very upfront and says, well, here's an interpretation of that, so don't take it for everything, but here's one of the ways is, and I think it helps us go back and realize that the people in the Old Testament are far more like we are even now than they are unlike us. We have this sort of, I think C.S. Lewis referred to it as historical arrogance, that somehow no one was ever as smart as we are. And, oh boy, that just doesn't fly. Human beings have really been pretty much the same. Human nature hasn't changed since the fall. And that's why these are such important lessons and lives. So that's why I wanted those lessons of faith in the lives of the men and women of Scripture, a wonderful resource for us. And the Scriptures tell us this is one of the reasons that we're told a lot of these things, is because at the end of the day, again, the context for all of this stuff is good old salvation history. That's what the Bible is. It's not an encyclopedia on God. It's not a handy reference. It's the history of salvation, and we're told all the things that we need to know for salvation to be able to trust this God who has created us. But we aren't necessarily told everything we might want to know or everything that there is to know, because we couldn't know everything. I couldn't know all that anyway. So the context for the patriarchs is salvation history. And I did that class, and again, that's one of those wonderful things that got recorded, so it's online now. But for me, everything in the Bible, when you're going to go looking at it and try and interpret what's the intent of the author, the context of it is, where are you within salvation history, within that arc? And one of the easiest ways and most effective ways, in my opinion, to understand that salvation history, again, are those 7 major biblical covenants. So as we start looking at the patriarchs, that's one of the first things I'm going to do, is make sure that we know, well, where are we within that arc? Now, this will do a quick review, so those of you who are at home, you don't have to answer unless you want to try and put it in the chat real quickly or something. But those 7 major biblical covenants are, first, come on, don't kill me here. Adam, the Adamic covenant. Covenant with Adam. After the fall, God says, I'm going to send a Savior. I'm going to send a deliverer who will be the seed of woman. So that's the number one. That's the first biblical covenant, is with Adam. What's the second biblical covenant? Noah. That was 2. Not going to destroy all life on the planet. What was 3? Abraham. Abrahamic covenant. By the way, that's okay. It tells me, for all those people go, we've gone over that. Yeah, and guess what? We need to keep going over it. I would truly recommend, these are 7 things that are pretty easy to memorize. They also are absolutely, and I'm going to cover a little bit more of that in this class, absolutely part of the best explanation of why the salvation history seemed to move in such a jerky fashion, in the sense that if there are 7 major biblical covenants and we have lived through the first 6, we're after the fulfillment of that sending of the Messiah, that 6th major biblical covenant. So we are in the end times. We've been in the end times for 2,000 years, and we may be in it 2,000 more for all we know. But we're 6/7 of the way through. But one of the things about understanding the connection of these 7 major biblical covenants, I think helps explain some of, why is this so unevenly spaced in terms of time? Because, boy, there are some that there is a long time in between the promise and the fulfillment. And we'll go back and take a look at that, particularly with the case of Abraham. That's part of his context, really. So what's the 4th? I heard somebody keep saying it, so now we're at Moses, the Mosaic covenant. Number 5, the Davidic covenant. I'm going to send the Messiah. The Messiah is going to come through the family of Abraham. It's going to come through the people of Israel. It is going to come through the line of David. And again, if you think about these things, this is a coming into focus description. Who's this Messiah going to be? Well, he's going to be a descendant of Abraham. He is going to be from the people of Israel. He is going to be a king, the king, because what happens during the time of David and Solomon? well, actually, Saul, David, and Solomon. And it started with Saul. The people had rejected. So what happens during Moses? Well, God is their king, except they reject God as king. And then God says, okay, I'll give you a king, and then you'll rue the day that you asked for it, and then someday I'll give you a king whose kingdom will come, will never have an end. You begin to hear some of the theme throughout. So, I mean, one of the things about salvation history is if we can begin to understand it as a story, it's going to make a whole lot more sense, because God is essentially having this long-running argument with his people, whom he calls, and we'll cover that in the Patriarchs, I'm going to give you a new name, and your name is going to be the one I fight with. The one who fights with me and the one whom I fight with. What a great description of a member of the family. I love you enough to get in your face and to let you get in my face, and we're going to go at it, and we're going to wrestle with one another. You know, he becomes Israel, the one who God strives with, the one who strives with God. It's right there in the name. So that's a little peek into, when we get further down into the Patriarchs. But this is how this is the theme of salvation history, this interaction that God has had with us throughout the centuries. Okay, the sixth major biblical covenant, obviously, is the covenant with Jesus, the first coming of the Messiah, and that was a covenant of salvation. These are not covenants of salvation. These are covenants, the Noahic, Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic are not covenants of salvation. They all have to do with who this Messiah is going to be. The first one and the sixth one are covenants of salvation. And then the seventh one that is yet to come, and that is the second coming. So, if you want a longer description of all of this, you can take that. I called the class Covenant Theology, because really that's one of the things that this is called. It's a recognition that covenant, if we understand covenant, that's one of the best ways to understand how God has chosen to relate to us throughout history, through these covenant promises and the nature, the difference between a covenant and a contract and all the rest of that stuff. So, but anyway, all that is available for you if you want to take a look at that. I think it was one of the best classes I've ever done. I'll risk saying that because, oh man, that's a terrible eraser. You'd think that for months we haven't been using this stuff. Oh boy. That's bad. I'll have to mark that down as something we need to work on. Now, the Abraham falls in between the second covenant and the fourth covenant. That's where this covenant with Abraham falls in there. And it's important to recognize the context in terms of not just salvation history, but in this respect, world history. Abraham is recorded for us as being one of those people very early on in history. Now, the history that the Bible talks about is that God created two people, Adam and Eve. Now, there's some references in Genesis where some other people are showing up, or we're not exactly told where they came from, and all the rest. Again, those are some questions that people have about history. But fairly early on, and this is what the Bible affirms, you have humanity, and there's one God. They know who he is. They've been disobedient, but they know who he is. They have a relationship with him, and they have one culture and one language, because they started very small. Now, as this thing keeps going, this is where it's called the Primeval Prologue. Again, the first 11 chapters of Genesis talk about the Primeval Prologue. Who are we? How did we get here? If God is all good, how come the world's messed up? Those first 11 chapters really cover that, including God's promise that he's not going to. He got frustrated with us at one point, almost wiped us entirely off, except again, and I covered that in the covenants class. Why didn't he just wipe the slate completely clean? Well, because he had promised to Adam and Eve that he was going to send a Messiah. So guess what? He can't do that. It's part of his nature. He never goes back on his word. He fulfills it. But after the flood, and we start over again with essentially one family, what happens? It goes bad again. And the Tower of Babel is really the immediate context for Abraham. From a standpoint of certainly salvation history, we have no idea of how we could verify or prove in terms of world history how long between Babel, which is where suddenly there are different languages, and now you start creating different ethne, is the Greek for it. Ethne is nation, from which we get the word ethnic. Well, that would not be the way you spell ethnic, Kevin. That hasn't changed. Isn't it nice to know that some things never change? Mostly I can't spell. Nations. Where do these different nations come from? Now, eventually nations, so they don't start out nations, do they? But they have different languages, and now they aren't cooperating together, and they're spreading out all over the earth. By the way, and I can't remember now whether I covered that in the covenants class, but that's also one of the reasons, why does God do that? Well, they're going to build a tower to reach to heaven. Really? He was afraid they were breaking into heaven. I don't think so. However, splitting us up into different groups, that way if one group goes bad, the whole experiment doesn't go bad. And what was the original command to Adam and Eve? Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. He renews that with Noah, tells Noah, go, spread out. So what did they do? They stayed right in the same spot. So when the apostles do the same thing, go, and they all stayed in Jerusalem, they're just standing in a long history and tradition of humanity not getting it right. So it's wonderful lessons there again about people. When we get frustrated with ourselves or frustrated with our society, well, join the long line of everything that's gone on across humanity. That's pretty much the way we are. But Babel, they're spreading out, and at this point they aren't really so much nations. What you find at this point in Abraham's time, because he is growing up in a place called Ur, and we'll cover more about that later, but in Ur is at that point what you, in terms of world history, they referred to as city-states. Not even so much states, because they're mostly just cities. They're metropolitan type areas within a given area, and the whole of human culture is developing and shifting. Different languages, different cultures, different nations eventually create wars between all these people. They don't trust each other, they don't like each other. They think that they are separate races. That's where that crazy idea came from, and there's only one race and it's human. But all that stuff is developing. And Abraham is being called by God out of Ur. And it's during a time, again, where you don't have empires yet. You don't really have nations per se. You have these larger cities and people that are kind of nomadic, and that's sort of where things were. That's part of the context of it. Also, certainly from a salvation history standpoint, I need to get a clock in here so I know what time it is, because otherwise I have to keep looking at my watch, which I will do. Except my watch sometimes doesn't want to come up when I when I turn it. Anyway, the the context of it, particularly in terms of salvation history, and this is a question I get asked occasionally, but not very often. People will ask, well, if Adam and Eve knew that there was one God, that's called monotheism. Well, what happened? How did we get all these people believing in different gods? What, you didn't tell your kids? According to the scriptures, Cain and Abel and then Seth had firsthand experience with God themselves. So how do we get all these different religions? How do we, and that's where and I'm not going to read it or go over it because that's a whole other class in itself. And I've talked about it before, and it's the Neighboring Faiths by Winifred Cordovan. And one of the things in his introduction, most of this is taken out of his introduction, which is really worth reading. The origins of religion is a question that used to be asked. The study of religions used to be part of university life. That was part of the academy. Unfortunately, the theory of evolution, which is, in my opinion, not even a good scientific theory, much less a sociological theory, it's a terrible sociological theory, is simply a theory, and it's not actually supported very well by the facts. And if this is for you to read later, but if you look on that second page, the evolutionary approach, actually the evolutionary approach took the assumption that Og the caveman, went outside and he watched lightning, and eventually he develops language, but he knows there's power greater than him, but he's not really, So you start this pyramid there, mana or fetishism. That's the idea that mana is the spiritual power that is in there. Oh, this stick is special stick, because when I held it up, then the dinosaur ran away. Oh yeah, whatever. This is again this assumption that we went from ape, ooze to ape to thinking about things. And so that develops then into animism, then polytheism, then henotheism, and then finally monotheism, except that's not really final, is it? Because as far as evolutionary theory is concerned, we discover now that there really is no God. We're just projecting ourselves on the universe, where the man is the measure of all things, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that's the whole development of that. Well, that runs contrary, certainly to the scriptures, but actually it runs contrary to good sociological study also, because many of the most primitive peoples that have been found turn out to be monotheists. They believe there's a one all-powerful God. Where did they get that? They're not allowed to do that. They should be back there with, animism, or, they wouldn't even be in polytheism yet, much less henotheism. So, interesting argument. I wanted you to be able to take a look at that. The Cordovan basically says, if you look at this fairly, it is certainly a reasonable theory from a sociological standpoint that, in fact, you had an original monotheism from which these other religions, these other belief type systems really degenerate. That you go from monotheism to henotheism, to polytheism, to animism, to mana and fetishism, as you move further and further away from the original understanding. Certainly, that's what's going on in the context of Ur. These are people who are no longer worshiping the one God. There are many gods, and part of, we know there was a thing called a ziggurat, and at the top of that, this is where the religious ceremonies were done, and one of those ceremonies was, everybody knows that if you want to have lots of kids, you sacrifice the first one to the gods. Take them up on the ziggurat, kill them, especially if it's a boy. Girls didn't hardly even count. But you always sacrifice the first child, particularly if it's the boy, because that way the gods will bless you with many more children. Where does this come from? We have no idea. It's not recorded for us. But that's one of the very significant things, and we'll see that in the life of Abraham, that he is called out of Ur in part because he's being called away from this understanding. And one of the struggles for him, again, this was the faith of his fathers. Because how is faith passed on? Well, you're born into that family, that's your faith. If you're this nation, these are the gods you believe in. If you're this nation, this is the gods you believe in. Don't you be, And the gods were local. Anyway, all kinds of. So this kind of, it's not really a polytheism. It's because those competing nations would say, well, your God's not the real God. Our God, and when we win in the war, we'll prove to you our God stomped you and your God. That was a big Old Testament understanding. That when nations went to war, the gods were going to war, and they were going to prove which God was the real God, who was the strongest God, or who was the greatest God. That was all part of that understanding. So that's some of the in essence, religious context of the patriarchs. God is going to do a new thing. He made a covenant with Noah, Now, it's gone back the way it was going before the time of Noah, and the world's getting bad, and people are going in every different direction, and God calls out of Ur this one man who is going to have a different experience with the one true God. So, and then this is the faith that is going to be passed on down through the patriarchs. So that helped some in terms of, to me, this is one of those things that this is really, really significant. If we're really going to understand what's going on with the patriarchs, we have to understand, again, for them, they really did believe that ultimately this had to do with the gods. By the way, none of these people were stupid. They didn't think that they were going to live forever. They understood death. You are going to die. So where are you going to spend all of your dead life? Because that's going to be a lot longer. This was a concern. They were far more religious in one sense than our society is becoming, that blithely goes along as if, well, we're never going to die. Except we might get COVID and we'll cry. Okay, that's one of the reasons why we're going collectively nuts. Our society has rejected the only real hope, and then they don't want to live hopeless lives, so they just hope in something or other. Okay, well, that's really focused. So lessons, again, we can, to learn from the scriptures. But one of the key elements of this kind of where they are now with kind of these city states, as it were, mostly just cities with the different nations, ethnicities, really, it had a whole lot to do here, try not to be surprised, with language. You felt a kinship with people you could communicate with. The further apart their language was, the more foreign they were, the more difficult it was to interact with them. And the closer the language was, or if it was the same language, well, these are my peeps. I don't really care. It's not like they had a passport. Can we see what land you're from? A lot of this had to do with being able to identify either by custom, dress, look, but certainly language. Tower of Babel. This is what's happened to this human experiment, because this is the direction God has moved it. And so part of the thing for the patriarchs is both Abraham being called out of the faith of his fathers, but Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph being the fathers whose faith their family was obligated to carry on. This is the faith of our fathers. That brings us, in the little overview of the four, this is just to mention, there are four, when you're talking about the patriarchs, sort of as a group in Genesis, those names are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now, that's a very arbitrary kind of historical analysis. First of all, firstborn son, well, except in Jacob's secondborn, but he got that's part of that whole story. But, it's father to son, father to son. Well, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, because Jacob is one of Isaac's sons. But Joseph, not be the firstborn. Should have been Reuben, right? And now he's just a good sandwich. Thank you for at least that little chuckle. I hope someone, now I'm getting the, well, it's not easy to come up with biblical humor, but why not Reuben? Well, and again, we're told some of that. And that, if we can hear it again, we can kind of, or see it, put on some Old Testament eyes and listen through Old Testament ears, this was very significant. This is some of the whole aspect of what kind of God is this that we worship that breaks these laws. Well, whose laws were they? Well, the firstborn son got a double portion. So if you had two sons, you divided your estate into three parts, and the firstborn son got 2/3, and the secondborn son got 1/3. If you had 5 sons, you divided your estate into 6 parts. The firstborn son got 2/6, and the other ones all got 1/6. Yeah.
Why do you not consider Noah to be one of the patriarchs?
Really, that's in many respects, that's why I said it's sort of an arbitrary historical thing. There's a huge shift, and I think it's one of those things covenant-wise, when we see that covenant with Noah is a restart in some respects. And then as this goes forward, mostly it's the way that when the Jews referred to the patriarchs, almost none of them really talked about Noah as a patriarch. This is one of the, and that's what we're going to be covering a little bit next. And by the way, on this, I'm not going to be a slave to these notes. One of the things that when I was doing it at home by myself, I kind of went, well, hey, look, I can get through all of it because I just won't say as much or stop or anything else. And we aren't bound to all this, and I'd much rather, deal with those questions. But part of Abraham's thing is at this point now, because faith in God is tied to the faith of your fathers. Noah and his clan are part of repopulating the entire earth, but there's no real information of how it spread out. Again, after Babel, now all of a sudden you have all these, and the issue for Abraham's time, and this to me is one of those salvation history principles. God's trying to communicate with human beings. I've spent most of my adult life trying to do that, and I have an appreciation for how hard that is. And I'm only doing it in one language. I can't imagine doing it across all the rest of that. This has got to be. But at any given time, when you're trying to communicate with people, what are they focused on? You can tell them all the things in the world you want to, but if they aren't ready to hear it, if it isn't what they're interested in, you ain't going to get their attention, right? Didn't we learn this as parents with our children? Were you listening to me? No, of course not. I wanted this over here. There's some sense in which God has to get in our face about what our issue is. And from the time of Abraham, after Babel, when you have all these multiple theistic ideas, here's the position God's in. How do I get across to them again who I really am? How do I reveal myself to them? And it is going to be through the faith of the fathers. And the first one of those really is Abraham. Because you can't really say, well, the Jews, because he's the beginning of the Jews. Actually, he's not in that respect. And that's part of the story. He's also the beginning of the Arabs, not just the Jews. This is another one of those fascinating things about the patriarchs. The overall issue is, at this point in human history, people are thinking in terms of, I have the faith of my father, because otherwise I've got nowhere to go. It's a patriarchal society. You are going to go with the faith of your fathers. And how do you do that when none of the fathers at this point are correct about their understanding of God? And so God pulls out Abraham and he becomes the first patriarch. But again, all that's wrapped up in kind of an interpretation. Mostly when the Jews, the way they would always tell the history in some respects, it's always Father Abraham. No one ever calls him Father Noah. And that's, again, just part of the patriarchal period of time in some respects, because when you get to Moses, there's in the covenant class, that's what I talked about, is when you're getting to time of Moses, now all of a sudden you have these city-states that are really city-states, and you have the beginning of empires, and you have this concept of law that is a very different. So how is it God is trying to communicate with his people now who he has chosen and is calling out of Egypt? I am the lawgiver. Well, he could have said that all along, except it wouldn't have been in context. in the context of Moses' time, who gives the law? Well, the king gives the law. And the king cannot be subject to the law because the king gives the law. The king is above the law, which is why, again, later on for Israel, this is no, God is king. And even when you have an earthly king, that earthly king still answers God's law because God is the true giver of the law. But those are all, again, contexts that, until we see some of the change in history and worldview people have, it doesn't make much sense. Why are you doing this? To me, this was one of the things that was fascinating just in reading world history, was realizing that you went through periods, humanity went through different periods of understanding. There's not time for it, obviously, and the Bible doesn't really cover it per se. It's kind of a non-issue in some respects, but in world history, one of the big studies about the gods and the development of the understanding of religions was this is where you have moved from it's a kind of form of polytheism, but from moving from polytheism to henotheism. Well, polytheism included household gods. You still see that in a lot of the Hindu, belief. You got a household god, and but he doesn't control your house. He only controls my house, and I worship him. And so you had that kind of polytheism, and then within cities or groups, and they're having more interaction with one another. That just got way too confusing, and what difference does it make anyway? Because as soon as you step past your threshold, it doesn't do you any good, and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's when you start getting the henotheism, which is a smaller group of more powerful gods who oversee all of that stuff. So they're very interesting conversations. Again, we think because of our media stuff and how much information we have available and the availability to dump stuff like this all over the World Wide Web, that we're the first generation to come along that had a generational dialogue, and that's just historical nonsense. All throughout history, societies themselves are made up of the great movements, really, are part of that overall dialogue and understanding. So Joseph wouldn't necessarily qualify, except, again, when you go back and look at it, the key role that Joseph plays. But I say this only because I've been in some conversations where no, it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Doesn't include Joseph. And I just want to say, okay, and where is that written? Show me the verse that says, and the 4 patriarchs were, or the 3 patriarchs were, or this is our interpretation. If you'll read the book of Genesis, here are your 4 main characters starting from Genesis 12. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. There's a few others in there. Joseph obviously had a number of brothers and stuff like that, but the main characters of that are those 4, and hence the term patriarch for them. I need to check my time. Yeah. The other thing I want to say kind of as a preliminary is that when we're looking at the patriarchs, we have to understand some of what a patriarchal family was like. What was it? Because the culture itself was built on patriarchal families. A wonderful book came out, I think, just in 2012 or something, When the Church Was a Family by Joseph H. Hellerman. Fascinating and very detailed look going back and saying, part of our problem in America is that, certainly our family is, our understanding of family is in serious trouble. I don't like Hollywood, but they have certainly proven to be some of the front runners in trying to get out bizarre ideas. And the whole sitcom show, Modern Family, in my opinion, is a horrible idea. The family is what the family is. It is not what anything that you make it. Family is one of the key principles. God created human beings, male and female, and that they would come together and that they would reproduce, and that would, the family is an inherent unit of humanity. You can't do away with it, and redefining it and messing around with it is a horrendously bad idea. But in America, even when we had the nuclear family is actually, from the standpoint of a biblical understanding of family, a horrible idea. Your family is mother, father, son, daughter, that's it. Really? Bible knows nothing of that kind of family. And we are telling our kids, and we were told, a lot of us, that it's our personal relationship with God. It's all about the individual, not about the family. And one of the things that he does in the book that is, I think, really good is he goes back and looks at, for the most part, throughout most of recorded human history, most civilizations understood that your identity is not just as an individual, but your identity is also being part of whatever family that you have been born into and that you grow up in. That's who you are. He has some wonderful, it's interesting too, because he talks about the fact this is so ingrained in us, in our culture, about the individual, that we have very little idea of how warped, from a biblical perspective, that is. That we do not have any real appreciation for the sense that and he refers to it, and it's sociologists, this is a sociological term, strong group society versus an individualistic society. You pretty much need to study Western civilization if you want to look at an individualistic society, and it's the latter part, as we are in the decline, of the Western civilization. This is one of the contributing factors, is that we have become so individualistic, we have lost any sense of group. He offers an interesting illustration, actually, in the book from the movie The Titanic. So, because the Titanic is, the movie itself is a story that only makes sense in an individualistic society. Because in it, and I never watched it, so I'm just have to go with what he says in the book, because my wife went, well, you want to watch that? It sinks. Sorry. On my entertainment dollar, I would like to be uplifted. I don't really, a lot of people, okay, no, thanks. But anyway, apparently the main characters in there's a girl on board who is on her way to an arranged marriage. Now, it's an arranged marriage because it benefits the family because her father had gambled away the family fortune, and she was going to be marrying back into some other money that would help but she doesn't love this guy. Instead, here's Leonardo DiCaprio who is just a working stiff, and he's on board for that reason. But that's a true love, and but in the book he talks about the fact that and I don't know if it was his daughter or something, but was talking to a gal who was over from the Orient, and where they still do a number of arranged marriages. And she watched the movie and went, that's terrible. That's awful. She's spitting in the face for, you don't do that. Part of your identity is you're just not you, you're a part of a family. And whatever decision you make, even as an individual, have to be done in light of what is good for the family. And the idea that you do something that's good for you and shafts the family is a horrible idea culturally. That's a patristic family. That's the family of the Old Testament. We need to hear that because it reads just like, okay, so God called Abraham out of Ur and away from his father's gods. Yeah. Well, why not? I mean, that's just this is to do the unthinkable. The interesting thing about Heller's comment when the church was a family, because he says we need to understand that's the New Testament world that Jesus is addressing, and when he chooses to call the church family, and when Jesus says, if you are going to be one of my followers, you must at times hate your mother and your father and leave your sister and brother and join the family that is the church. I'm only about halfway through. I'm really appreciating it's very challenging because I grew up in I grew up in a very wonderful little nuclear family because both my parents were only children, and all but one of my grandparents was dead before I was ever born. And the one that was alive visited for the first time when I was 4, and then once again when I was 11. So we had a pretty nuclear family, which seemed to me to be fairly normal, because we're have much of any other choice. But still, the whole push of individuality and the sense of loyalty to family is hard for us, I think, to wrap our heads around. So that's, if you're looking for some interesting reading, that is a very interesting book to check into. Sorry about this microphone. I want to say too, because I mentioned on the, come on, watch, tell me what time it is. All right. In this study, the patriarchs, I want to actually do this because I know Beth Moore has done a study on the patriarchs. I haven't seen it or anything because I got a copy of it, so I want to take a look and see what, because I think she has been an excellent Bible teacher, and I think, but I'd said, I'm going to teach this class on the patriarchs from the standpoint of a patriarch, because I now qualify. Both my parents are gone. Both Robin's parents are gone. We are now, Robin was an only child. I do have a sister and a brother-in-law, but they're not really, one of those interesting things Heller points out is actually from a patristic family standpoint, the relationship between husband and wife was not actually as close as brother and sister. And we'll talk a little bit about that because that comes into play all through the history and life of the patriarchs. When a woman got married, she did not sever all ties with her biological family. That's a modern idea. That is not a biblical idea, and it's not supported in the scriptures. So we'll talk about some of that. That's one of those interesting dynamics in all of this. But in my opinion, one of the things that is really critical, and I think I hope is useful out of this study, for a long time, and in our society, the whole concept of masculinity has been under attack. We don't have a very good definition of what it means to be a man. We don't have a good definition of what it means to be a father. And in one respect, one of the things that the patriarchs do in their interaction with God, the Father, is play out what is that role supposed to look like? What should a father be? What should a father be? The father is as the authority figure. And we're going to talk a lot about this as we go through looking at all four of them, that the father is the authority figure, certainly in a patristic society, and what's the proper use of authority? The proper use of authority is to protect and provide. Now, what happens when that doesn't get played out? And I want to argue, not this morning, it's still before noon, not this morning, but throughout this, I want to make the argument that some of what we've seen in America in the last 100 years has been a long-standing historical argument that a lot of people have had with authority. I mean, this is one of the problems we have in America. Authority and power. Who's got it? How do they get it? What do they do with it? This is, and again, I'll come back to this because I actually woke up at 3 a.m. with this in my head. So, because I was trying to figure out how to describe this. If you are going to look at relationship spectrum, and love is at this end of the spectrum. That's the destination God would have us go to, because that's who He is. If hate is at the other end of the spectrum, then justice or equality is really in the center. Now, our society has said, it's in the process of saying this over and over and over again, in every social justice thing that is in the media right now, we have in our society raised equality to being the highest good. And it's not. Love is the highest good. Because equality is midpoint. If you love somebody and you just treated them equally, well, you should treat everybody equally. And equality and justice are both really very dispassionate, and they should be. They're not supposed to be passionate, they're supposed to be impassionate. It's fair, but fair to give people who didn't do anything something, the labor of somebody who did something is unjust. That's stealing from the rich and giving to the poor is still stealing. You know, what we have misunderstood is this. Now, why? I'm going to argue throughout this study that this is part of the problem with the abuse, with the use and abuse of authority and power. But that's an issue that is not just related to men, but it got focused on that. And just think about, one of the reasons I quoted that on the back side of your paper, there is a quote from Hellerman about the family and the difference between a individualistic society and a strong group society. But the other quote that I included there is from Helen Smith's, she's a PhD psychiatrist. She wrote a book called Men on Strike, Why Men Are Boycotting Marriage, Fatherhood, and the American Dream, and Why It Matters. I thought it was fascinating. I ran across it several years back. It was really sad, in some respects horrifying, and predictive. It's the first place that I had read, because I didn't realize this, and it's now already true. 2/3 of all of the students in universities in America are women. Young men are dropping out of college. They're either dropping out or just plain choosing not to go. They are not getting married. They don't want to get married. And they are just basically finding nowhere to go. Why? Well, in some respects, we have been attacking men and masculinity for a long time. I mean, decades. That's another. She writes, and this is just in her introduction. I just have a few minutes, but I do want to. I've spent many years talking to hundreds of men about their deepest, darkest secrets. Many have been afraid to talk, and for others it was a relief. But the one thing they all had in common was a feeling that they were wimps for having problems. And they felt a reluctance to go against what society expected of them, to provide for women and their families with nary a whimper. Even if the women are cheating on them, by the way, women commit adultery at the same rate as men do in America. Women cheat on their husbands as much as men cheat on their wives. That has been true for a decade. Even if the women are cheating on them, even if they were raising children alone and the women refused to help with support, and even if their children weren't theirs. But the anger was there, seething below the surface, and in therapy it came forth in physical and emotional ways that wreaked havoc with these men and their bodies and minds. And they believed no one cared because in reality few did. Men kill themselves over pain like this, and the statistics show they do it often. In 2010, the latest suicide statistics show that 38,364 people killed themselves nationally, and 30,277 of those were men. There has been such a significant attack on the whole concept of masculinity. Now, part of that is we've had a very poor definition of it, and so that's one of the things I think the patriarchs, in one sense, offer us that opportunity to come back and say, wait a minute, and I need to wrap up today, and we can come back to some more of this. But for my money, of all the things of a definition of masculinity, the best definition I've read came from Emerson Eggerich's book, Love and Respect, the love she most desires and the respect he desperately needs. And he has an acrostic he calls chair to describe men. The desire to work and achieve, which he calls conquest. The desire to protect and provide, hierarchy. The desire to serve and lead, authority. The desire to analyze and counsel, insight. The desire for shoulder-to-shoulder friendship, relationship. Now, because I am going to inject gender into this, which of course would get me targeted by a number of the social justice warriors, should anybody but a handful of people ever see this, so I'm not really too worried. That's one of the advantages of being here in this lovely area where no one really knows that we exist. It's relatively safe, but one of the things that we really do need to understand and go back and look at, and I believe that, again, there are lessons for us there in the lives of the patriarchs about this, about spirituality, authority, virtues, and gender. Because one of the difficulties that, for most of human history, virtues were considered to be sort of gender-oriented, that courage was a male virtue. Well, that's just a terrible definition of virtue and courage, because women are very courageous, and we should want our daughters and our wives to be courageous. They're just going to go about it differently than men do. Oh, you can't say that. Different is inherently unequal. Okay, well, thank you for once again elevating equality to the highest good when it's not. It is not the highest good. Your heart is not equal to your foot. Your foot cannot pump blood, and your foot would not last a minute without your heart, and your heart cannot walk anywhere. But at the end of the day, if you have to lose your heart or your foot, lose your foot. This is one of those things, again, where equality, we're going to have to go back and deal with this all the time, because, in my opinion, this has been one of the craziest arguments in the 20th and 21st centuries, has to do with this misunderstanding about equality and justice. And what's fueled it, sadly, and I think we need to recognize this, has been an abuse of authority and power in some places. But the idea that you can get rid of authority and power so that then there will never be any abuse again is ludicrous. And the people who are putting it forward are using power and authority in a horribly, horribly oppressive way, openly, and no one's calling them on it. At some point, we need to figure out how to be men and women again, because that's how God made us. And we need to understand how that fits together, how that we have things that are in common, which is our spiritual life, and how we are different from one another because we're supposed to be. We are not supposed to be the same. That is a ludicrous idea. And in my opinion, a lot of this comes back again to a misunderstanding of what is authority and what is the proper use, and what is the proper significance of power and authority. How is it supposed to be used? And with the patriarchs, what you see is the interaction between these men who, because of their position within the society and the understanding of the society, were doing that, relating to a God who has a very different definition of what is the proper use of power and authority. Because love is submissive. It's not domineering. And power and authority, and we'll get a chance to look at some of Eggerich's, because I think these are some wonderful definitions of how that plays itself out. That the desire to serve and lead is what authority is all about. Well, wait a minute. Did we hear that? The desire to serve and lead. Because leading is not about having everybody follow you and pat you on the back. Lead is about being the point of the bow of the icebreaker that has taken the brunt of it and making way for everybody behind them. The good leader, the godly leader, is leading to serve. And the godly leader actually is taking it on the chin a lot. And they deserve and need that love and support and respect and all those things. So for me, I'm looking forward to doing this because I feel like this is an opportunity to address an issue that I keep looking for somebody to write some stuff on. And this Helen Smith, who, by the way, as far as I can tell, is not a Christian. She is just someone who is terribly concerned about what's gone wrong with our society. And her book, and I think it was back in before 2010 that she wrote it. Maybe not, may have been, but somewhere around then. It's funny, I have the Kindle version of it, and it won't tell me when it was published. It's missing the copyright page in the Kindle version. I don't know what's up with that. I'll go back and check that out. But this was written a while ago, and the stats that she gave even back then are worse than ever before. But it's certainly true. Marriage is nigh on dead in America. And that ought to concern us. But my feeling is here's somebody who is, and that's actually the first part of her introduction. Why is a woman writing this book? Why isn't a man writing this book? Well, because we have destroyed, we have targeted men so much in the society that it's just not worth it to anybody. And it's, some scary times in that respect. But again, turns out the Bible does have lots of things to teach us on this. So anyway, hope this has been helpful, and it's a little bit past 12, and I need to eat so I don't get hangry. So let's pray together. Lord, we thank you again that you are a God who has chosen to work in history, to create history, to actually do things, and to include us in that. That we can know that you've called us to do things with you that actually make a difference in history and in the future. We ask, Lord, that you would help us to be able to trust again that this history that you are writing is never out of your control. But help us to learn from those patriarchs and from their lives, their successes and their failures, that we might trust that you have called us to do the same, to follow you, and to understand your heart, and to be the people you have called us to be. Bless us now as we go our separate ways, and bring us back together again safely next week. For we pray these things in Jesus' name. And all God's people said, amen.